Hi, welcome to the Peace and Dignity Journeys PowerPoint presentation. The Peace and Dignity Journeys is an intercontinental indigenous spiritual run. Every 4 years since 1992, runners start from opposite sides of the Western Hemisphere, and we've run beginning from Alaska and Tierra del Fuego, Argentina. For over about 7 months, we run to hundreds of indigenous communities along the way until we get to a final destination point. The Journeys is based on the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, and it was born out of the gathering of 1990 in Quito, Ecuador, which I will get into more in depth into these topics later. This picture right here is of runners in Alaska in May. This is to depict what types of weather we run in. In that time, it's frozen. You can barely breathe. This is in Alaska and Yukon. And every single day we get up and we run. And we do this for 7 months. Um, and this is a picture of me back in the days, I think in 2008. Super cheesy as always. Um, Behind is a glacier. It looks unreal. And, every time we start running in the north, we start off with a lot of energy. And then after a few days, it gets pretty old because we know we have 7 months to go. Old in the sense of the energy, and we just gotta shift our mind into into um, into having the long run. So the purpose of the presentation is to give a history and the background of Peace and Dignities as a hemispheric indigenous movement, go in depth about the meaning of the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, go into the origins of Peace and Dignity from the gathering of 1990, which spawned it, and then I'm also going to go into um, ancient trade routes and migrations, which we follow while part of the run. And this is significant because these trade routes and these are many traverse various countries, and they are historical routes that have been in existence since time immemorial. And I'm also going to go into a very brief description of proto-linguistic families and their language families. And this is to show about native languages that currently exist and uh, that are related to other languages. So this is also significant components of the peoplehood model, which is one thing that I'm going to integrate. Even though the peoplehood model was um, in past readings, this is very significant to frame the peace and dignity journeys within the peoplehood model. And I'm also going to integrate the other readings into this presentation where I'll ask questions and sometimes provide descriptions. But um, one of the things that's significant with the journeys is that and the trade routes is really place and remembering our original places, um, our historical places, our lineages. I know some people don't have that, but others, we still have that. And part of that is reconnecting with our migration stories. Um, and these are very much alive in the journeys when communities share their stories. For example, there was a Kokopah elder that they ran in 1992. He came back to the US into Kokopah, and he told his elders that he saw a lot of people that looked like them, like Kokopah in Mexico. And his elder told him, well, that's where we're from. We're from that further southern part. So these types of stories, this is just one fragment of the stories and history that starts to reveal itself as doing these runs and reconnecting people and traversing these lands. The other thing is really the names of sacred places. One is Abya, which Dr. Keme in his reading, in order for indigenous communities to Abya to survive, America must die, or something to that effect. But Abya is a term that's also utilized within their journeys and is both in the north, central, and south. Aslan's a concept that of the north, but it also means other things. The Wantisuyo is also the land of the four quadrants, and these are all different parts of linguistic, historical, um, uh, sacred places that also have their own language and linguistic history as well. And one of the super important parts of the journeys is really acknowledging traditional territories. When we run into community, we organize with the local or regional organizers to host us, but we also acknowledge the traditional lands. This must be done as part of the protocol ceremonially because when we're entering in other people's land, even if the reservation or land base doesn't reflect their traditional territories, we recognize their traditional territories and we ask to be acknowledged, accepted, and we do ceremony to cross into that territory. Some things about ceremony I can't get into the specifics in the PowerPoint presentation or in class, but that's the most I can do. Um, so the journeys and the prophecy of the Iguan de Condor are also connected to historic ceremonial cycles. And these ceremonial cycles um, are ancient, but the peace and unity journeys has been adopted by, I would say, several hundred indigenous communities. So the communities are pretty much expecting the run to pass through their community every 4 years, and they participate. And so some communities have integrated this into their ceremonial cycles. Right here, this is a picture of runners from different areas. As I mentioned, runners come from different parts of Avia Yala. This right here is a picture of a runner from Alaska in the front, one from Jalisco, Mexico, and then another one from one of the pueblos in New Mexico. So this is one small depiction of the diversity of indigenous peoples that participate in their journeys. And I don't know if I mentioned, but this is kind of the Alaska Canada border where they're running. Um, a little bit of history and background of the journeys is what's going to take place next. And this picture right here is when we got to Panama in 2008. And this is on top of the Bridge of the Americas. And this is the moment when the staffs came together. It's a moment after you're super tired. Uh, you've been on the road for 7, almost 8 months. You're beyond exhausted, and you get to your destination and you bring this prayer together. You're carrying the prayers of the nations. Every single feather is a prayer from a nation. Many staffs were given to us by a nation to carry. So we're literally carrying the prayers of the people. There's a cross back there from one of the communities um, of Chiapas where there was a massacre. They gave us one of those. Each one of these staffs has a story and a purpose, and there's prayers deposited in them. So we bring together and we weave together the prayers of the North, Central, and South. So as I mentioned, the journeys is an intercontinental indigenous spiritual run. The purpose of it is to bring together indigenous communities in a ceremonial way. Um, it's to build ceremonial alliances, to bring together um, not only ceremonial people, but just the people at large. It's a form of cultural preservation. It's a form of indigenous autonomy and self-determination because the communities are the ones that really drive this run. If it wasn't for the communities, we wouldn't be able to do this run. We solely rely on them to host us, to feed us, to sometimes put a little bit of money in the gas tanks that carry to the vehicles that carry supplies. If it wasn't for the communities, the journeys couldn't take place. So one component I wanted to mention is about ceremonial running. And ceremonial running is one of the oldest ceremonies as one of my elders told me that native peoples possess. And in the south, on the top right corner, you can see the term, hopefully you can see it as chasque, and that's what the runners in the south have historically been called, chasques, and and they continue to be called that. Um, so one of the things I wanted to mention as well is that the runners carry these sacred staffs, and we have one main staff, and the Southern runners have another main staff. And ours is an eagle staff, and theirs is a condor. And the eagle staff is the one that always goes in front. It's the primary staff that we carry, and we it's the one that's pretty much in the lead. Most runners are sponsored by a community, and the majority of the time it's an indigenous community, and that ensures dual responsibility and accountability. And the runners are expected to follow ceremonial protocols. And ceremonial protocols for this run are uh, participating in the run, cleaning up, running, um, just helping out. And then on the other side is abstaining from utilizing drugs, abstaining from sexual intercourse, abstaining from drinking any forms of alcohol or any types of substances. And that's really important, and that's not only limited to the journeys. Many ceremonial ceremonies require this. So I'm going to show you a few pictures of runners on the road. Um, the top right is a runner from Taunatam from 2000. The top right are young children from the Kuna Nation in Panama running in 2016. The same time, 2016, bottom left corner is Vanessa Quesada. Vanessa Quesada is from Texas, and she and Anabel Gutierrez from Arizona led the run in 2016. They led the entire routes from Alaska to Panama. Um, on the bottom right is Mauricio in the south, and he's carrying the Condor staff, and he's from Colombia. More runners. Want to point out on the top right and then the bottom right are about 10 miles before running to one of the Zapatista communities, to Oventic. Um, the elders, the mujeres, the women are the ones that carry the staffs and led us, and we followed them on that 10-mile run to Oventic. On the bottom left is Gustavo Gutierrez, who was one of the main organizers of the run since the very beginning. He actually participated in the 1990 Quito gathering, which I will get into later. And it was because of him that Peace and Dignity Journey survived. In 1996, there wasn't going to be a run, but Gustavo took it upon himself to coordinate that run. And at that time, he was retired, and and he paid a lot of it out of his Social Security. And just one more thing about a couple of things about Gustavo. In Arizona and other parts, he's um, he's like one of those OG veterano heroes. He's been organizing. He was organizing for over 50 years, and he's worked a lot with the farm worker movement. He was one of the principal people that started the farm worker movement in Arizona. He merged it with the UFW. Him and Cesar Chavez were really good friends. Gustavo was the one that would read the messages when Cesar would fast. He would have Cesar Chavez. He would have messages every day, and Gustavo would read it. He was one of the founders of MCOP, which turned into Tonatiera. So I was really blessed to have Gustavo as a mentor, friend, and a tío. He was a founder of many organizations, and his legacy in the movement and his contribution will continue to be felt for a long time. Um, Here's some more pictures of on the top right, Tikal, when we're doing a ceremony in Tikal. It's right before we get to Washington. Top left is me with the main staff in Tula, with Little Cuautli was one of the runners, and I was teaching him about a little bit about his history and the pyramids there, how each of the way that Teocalli or pyramid was designed was that each of the corners was pointing to sacred mounds around San Ildefonso, which is one of the local communities, and that place is actually called Mini and not Tula by the local communities. Bottom left is one of the runners, Osobadli, aka Indio, and then Little Quali, which unfortunately I'm blocking out. Yeah, it was a cute picture. So I'm going to get into now a little bit about running epistemology. Both Roberto Rodriguez and Roberto Hernandez get into that in the readings. Um, and Roberto Rodriguez talks about a lot about centering ceremonial running within the Vario runs in Tucson. And one of the questions I have is, what is that significance? And then the second question is, what does Roberto Hernandez assert the significance of spiritual running and writing about it within and how that breaks the binary dichotomy within academic writing? So these are some questions for the class. So the next part I'm going to get into is to illustrate the routes, and this is, one of the depictions of the northern routes. And as you can see, we run every step of the way, and sometimes the routes are split. And even though there's a couple of routes that are illustrated, there's actually several other routes that are called tributary routes that are not in here, and they come from, let's say, the East Coast, that and Puerto Rico, the Caribbean. There's runs there. One comes down the East Coast into Florida, and then straddles the South and connects with the routes. So there's other routes that are part of it that are not listed. And the same as in the South. I'm showing the main route, and there's other tributaries that go into, like, from Brazil, Paraguay, and other areas that feed into the southern route. And because of the way the south is, this picture doesn't really do justice to the, compared to the north. The picture of the north, the south is huge. um, the next part I'll get into is the destination. um, for the first few runs, uh, we designated getting into Teotihuacan. So on October 12th, 1992, 500 years to the day of the landing of Columbus, the Peace and Dignity runners ran into Teotihuacan and they proclaimed, "We are here. We are designating this as 500 years of resistance and survival." Not only that, this prayer run was working to unify the communities and heal the nations. So for the first few runs, 92, 96, 2000, the runners would meet in Teotihuacan. We've also met in Tikal. We've also ran to Panama. For the 2020 run, we were supposed to run to Ecuador, but that got canceled because of COVID. But for 2024, we're expected to again run all the way from Alaska to Ecuador and meet the runners there. This next piece gets into the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, which is why. Why do we do this run? So the prophecy of the eagle and the condor is a prophecy that comes from the Mayan, Aztecas, and even other communities in the south, north, and other places. It's a metaphor in some ways that it's the eagle and condor. In other ways, it's not. The eagle represents the indigenous peoples from the north, and the condor represents the indigenous peoples from the south. And the way the necks are tied there represents movement. So that's the Olin, which is that every time you see that in a glyph, that means movement. The the eagle and condor are also constellations. The eagle is the northern star, and the condor is the southern cross. These are also components of this prophecy is also part of the calendar systems like the Mayan calendar. The Mayans have a version of it. The Quechuas have a Inti Pachacuti calendar system, which measures moons over several hundred to over 1,000 years, which are part of their cycles. Um, Sorry, I have something in my eye. And there's other communities that also have this prophecy. And what I'm going to is a pre-Columbian version of the Troll-Cortesian Codex, which on the top shows the eagle and the condor. And this is a pre-Columbian image to show this depiction. There's other ceremonial sites that have the eagle and the condor, like in the Yucatan, a place called Mayapan. There's several places that have this depiction that aren't just in the South. In Mexico, in the Museo de Antropología, there's a drum that's often, it's called the tlapahuehue, which is used now in Aztec dance. And this is another pre-Columbian drum, which has a representation of the eagle and the condor. On the right is a condor, as you can see, and on the left is the eagle. And in between, it's called the Atlachinoli, which means a fire in the water. And the Atlachinoli is actually the original uh, depiction of the founding of Mexico, or the Pantli Mexicayo, or the Mexican flag, which is um, not an eagle. I mean, not a snake. The eagle doesn't have a serpent, but actually has the Atlachinoli. And I'm gonna show now about the prophecy of the eagle and the condor in a similar way that's in this video. This is Tikal, which is northern Guatemala in the Petén region. So, as you saw in the video, the prophecy of the eagle and the condor is something that we have taken on. We do this through ceremonial running, and this was formed in Quito, Ecuador in 1990. There was an intercontinental gathering where there was a movement to create a declaration with different working groups on sacred sites and women, on sacred areas, on natural resources, and other things. And one of the things that they were also going to um, organize was a 500 years of resistance. because this was 1990, and in 2 years it was going to be 1992, which was be the time when 500 years of the quincentennial landing of Columbus. So they wanted to organize a hemispheric response, and they organized many events. And this kind of um, put it was like a watershed moment for the uh, indigenous communities, and then started to build intercontinental indigenous relationships. At that time, a version of the prophecy of the eagle and the condor was shared with the participants at Quito. And from there, they were given the mandate, like Gustavo and others that were there, that it's their job to bring together, to unite the eagle and the condor, to unite the indigenous peoples of North, Central, and South. A little bit after that, in New Mexico, they met with other organizers, and the Peace and Dignity Journey was built because part of the mandate was to bring together indigenous peoples together in a traditional ceremonial way. And this was through ceremonial running. And that's how the journeys was born. And this the Quito gathering was very significant to the formation of the journeys. And this was primarily organized by CONAI, which is a national organization of indigenous communities in Ecuador. And during the time of the Quito gathering, they had an uprising and basically shut down the country because there was discrimination, rising prices of basic needs, and people were fed up and they took over the country. So Sarah James was also down there, and she mentioned that there was a threat of a lot of violence. Some of these organizations that we know, Tonatira, ONIC, International Indian Treaty Council, were part of it, and many others. And eventually they formed CONIC, which was a confederation of indigenous nations, the Continental Confederation, which was another way of bringing together the Eagle and Condor, which was more political organizing, versus the Peace and Dignity was more ceremonial um, work. And these are a list of some of the uh, um, organizations and nations that became CONIC. And they also had international gatherings that I went to a few of them over the years. So that was, the significance of Quito, one of the significant things of Quito. Um, and as I mentioned, it was um, the prophecy was part of it, but I wanted to see where. Okay, I kind of gave that question away. I already answered that question about the Wetiko earlier, so I won't even go into that. But the next thing I'll do is I'll show a short video of the actual Quito gathering in 1990. So at this gathering, there were over 300 um, indigenous representation, indigenous peoples from throughout the North, Central, South. That this is the first time they came together. Like many of the people that participated in this gathering are no longer with us. They've passed into the spirit world, and so it's kind of almost a miracle that we got this video. It's Luis Macas. And Sarah. There's several people that were in Quito that later on and became organizers of Peace and Dignity. In our readings, Jack Forms uh, comes up with the concept huético. There's a couple of articles and that we were to read. And what is huético? What is huético in the in relations to colonization? What is that condition, and what does it do? Again, for our readings, the question is what is huético? What is huético in relations to colonization, and what is it? How does it show itself? Um, Please answer this question when you can. So the next piece I'm going to get into has to do with ancient trade routes, ancient migration routes, ancient ceremonial routes. These are all um, very important, have been historically very important for indigenous peoples, and they were cut off during colonization. So while we're on the run, we run through these old roads and we make sure that we uh, do the necessary offerings to keep them, to give them that respect. When we're in the communities, they share about their roads. The Blackfeet talk to us. There's a organizer that said that they used to have a road all the way to Mexico City. In Wisconsin, the Winnebago have talked about how they have descendants of from the Mayans. In more north in Minnesota, there's also stories of relationships with the Mayans. Same as in Alaska, um, and down south. There's old stories that are pockets of information um, that we get to hear as part of the run of these old historical relationships. Another example is I think Sarah shared a long time ago that up there they remember when the Apache were in the Alaska area, and at one time the Apache had canoe songs. At one time there were canoe people. So this goes back. Some of these stories go back a long time, and this is part of again the asserting, reasserting indigenous autonomy, memory, and a context to the historical relationships that we've had. Um, Many things were traded between North and South, South and North, and vice versa, East, West. And there's a big stereotype that indigenous peoples were stagnant, but that was more of a result of colonization and borders and all that kind of stuff. And so the next few pictures I'll show are of different trade routes. This one is of copper, obsidian, um, jade, turquoise, and the star areas are either almost like distribution centers, were either were major spots within trade routes, or were some of the goods and you know materials came from. So they were either producing sites or major trading hubs. And this is a depiction from PBS. It was during a Mayan video, and I was able to take a picture on the TV of another illustration of trade routes throughout North Central and South, and the white uh, lines are depictions of ancient trade routes. This other one um, depicts the parrot route, the trade routes for parrots, how parrots would come from South America and the Yucatan all the way to Paquime, which is about 100 miles south of El Paso. And parrots are very sacred and important to some of the tribes in New Mexico, the Zuni and other peoples, and some are even tied to their creation stories. There's other things such as I mentioned, turquoise jade, and another one that is in this picture are routes where cacao was traded all the way up from the south into the north. So cacao chocolate has always been the bomb, and it was even that back then. This is another illustration of sorry, Pakime, and on the bottom left is a picture of the cages where they used to breed or keep the parrots from the south, and these macaws and others that are very beautiful parrots were held there. And Pakime means the place, actually, lugar, the place of the parrots in the Opata language. So I wanted to, again, since the journeys deals with distance and long distances and stories and relationships and memories of old stories, one of the things that's also related to that is the linguistic families, because the linguistic families also come from very long distances, some um, in particular from very long distances. So some of the uh, for example, Proto-Nahuatl is the mother language, considered the mother language or the root language. And out of that, other languages like Tepehuan, Tonot, Opata, um, Yak, no, not Yaqui, Tonotam, Yu, Mono, like all these different Aztec, Nahuatl, Popoloca, I mean, all these different languages, Pipil in El Salvador, all these different languages are born from Hopi, the Ute Aztec language base. It actually goes even to further north, like Comanche. So this linguistic family stretches over a few couple thousand miles at least, and they all are rooted within what's called the Ute Aztec or Proto Aztec language. Similarly, the Dene language also comes from various areas. So folks usually know the Navajo who call themselves Dene. Well, in Alaska, they also call themselves Dene and speak Dene. They're all part of the Athabascan language family. And some of those are the Atna by the Atna River in Alaska, the Gwich'in, the Casca in the Yukon, the others in California, like the Hupa, Tolowa, the Oregon, again, the Navajo, Apache. And so this language family stretches a very long distance too. And there's stories of that, I think it was Sarah or somebody else from Alaska had told us while on the run that at one point the Apaches were up there in Alaska, and that at one time the Apaches had canoe songs. And there's other stories of other peoples that were up in Alaska that migrated south. But that language base is also a few couple thousand miles at least in distance where those languages are spoken. And they're not so far off as in um, like a Navajo elder who went with us one time on the run. She was able to speak to people in the Anchorage area that were from the Atna, and they could understand each other. It was some things were off, but they were still able to basically communicate each other in Dene. So you know, the memory of that is also coming back, um, but also the historical trade routes, the stories. That's also coming back, and the journeys is one of those vehicles that we are able to transmute or communicate this information because we cross so many countries. We go through these old traditional routes where these villages, these nations, these tribes are, these communities, these pueblos are on these old routes. They've been there and some haven't moved. The next thing I wanted to get to, which is related to, again, these are also components with the peoplehood model, is sacred places. This place is called the San Francisco Peaks. And the San Francisco Peaks has been under threat by for many, many years by Snowball because I don't know why people love to put ski resorts in Arizona on sacred sites, but that's the story of Snowball. And this place has 13 different names by 13 different tribes. It's sacred by different tribes. The O'odham have a name for it. Navajo, the Wallapai, the Hopi, the Pai Pai. I mean, there's the Sunni. There's so many different nations that have a different name for this, and every name is legitimate. Every name is just as important. And related to that, you know, there's this concept, which for some reason has become controversial over the last few years. But Aslan is just another name for a region. It's another name for Autumn Juvid, which is the Juvid Autumn, you know, territory, the Autumn Juvid, which is the Thon Autumn territory. And Aslan is just another name because at one point there were people here. There were seven different nations that 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 the they the names that they ended up with in Mexico, I'm sure, are not the names they or the identifications they had, like the Xochicalcas and those folks. They didn't have that name up here, but the Tenochcas and stuff. But Aslan is a region, and linguistically, and now even anthropologically, this region is being recognized as a place where there was a lot of movement that was in relation to what's known as Mesoamerica, but also independent. And this place is looked at as a place that has impacted other parts of the hemisphere, not just in Mexico. Um, this region, again, of what was created here, you know, I think it was like 800 to 1,000 plus years ago. And at one point in time, the Anasazi were here, the Hohokam were here, the Mogollon, um, and there's another one in Nevada. I can't remember. They were all in this region, and they left. But there's also stories that they migrated south. You know, Una and related to that linguistically, Una Kanger, who is a linguistic from Copenhagen University, I believe Jonathan Ahmed, who was at Yale, and I took a linguistics class over there, a summer program in Nahuatl. They say that Proto Nahuatl was born in this area, either within southern Arizona or northern Sonora. So now even what anthropology or archaeology in anthropology suggests as its own region, and then where people were once there, the ancient ones, Anasazi, um, and then the influence, that place, there was a lot of movement there. And that place was at one point either called Aslan or something else. Um, and I say something else is because a lot of the Aztecas were famously known to change names of stuff. Um, it might have been called something else, which was, I suspect it had a Tolteca name because the Toltecas originally had a similar story, but it was called Chicomostoc, which is also a Nahuatl-sized version of the Tolteca language, um, which is more ancient than the Aztecas. And this is a depiction of Chicomostoc, which is the place of seven caves, and that was also a place where, you know, I think it was in Moctezuma's Chimalpopoco, I believe. He sent an expedition to try to find Aslan, and they believe they found it. And there's different people have different versions, understandings of what it is. But there's actually stories. I'll just share this. There's stories of the not necessarily Aslan, but there's stories in the community that in near my hometown in the mountain ranges. There's some the Aztecas at one point went up there and buried a lot of stuff in those mountains. And I asked leader Hecateo, who was one of the leaders of the Tezcatlipoca traditions in Mexico, who super long lineage and know a lot of the histories. Oh yeah, we know about that. I'm not gonna tell you. I don't want to know. It's not for me. Related to that in southern British Columbia, this place, I'm not even gonna say a name. It's not my place. There's a mountain, and there's some caretakers of that mountain, and it's also under threat of being developed by Whistler Ski Resort, and they have a bundle that belongs to another tribe when that belongs in the West Coast, and that they said when the tribe is strong enough that they're gonna get their ceremonial items back. So this theme of returning, getting back, growing stronger, reconnecting, sovereignty, um, prophecy. These are all things that are happening in a lot of different ways, but it's just this time that these things are unfolding. And getting back to Chicomostok, I mean, I mentioned that the Anasazi were here. The pits or the kivas or they're like reconnecting to the Mother Earth, and ceremonies are there. This is in New Mexico también. Um, and the other thing with place and renaming place is coming using the older name, an ancient name, if you will, and renaming it. And there's many examples of this, but one I wanted to highlight is Nicaragua. Nicaragua is from two words, Nican and Nahuac. Nican and Nahuac. Nican means up until here is Anahuac, and Anahuac was was the was the border of where Anahuac for the Aztecas. This is up until our area. In other words, like Mexico. Mexico is Metzli Shitliko. There's three words in the word Mexico. And Metzli means moon, Shitli means a belly button, and Ko means a place. So Mexico is a small place in the center of Mexico City, and it's an ombligo. It's a ceremonial ombligo, and it's the belly button to the moon. That's what the word Mexico means. So that changes it. With Nicaragua, Mexico, these places help us start making a paradigm shift. Because once we make that paradigm shift and look at these places for what they are, what they historically have been, we can look at them in a different way. And we can ask ourselves different questions of the relationships to those peoples historically, the sacred landscapes, the sacred places historically, and how they relate to the present. In Nicaragua, when we ran there, they have a museum of the Toltecas. Um, there's stories of them. Maritza Centeno, who's an organizer from Matagalpa, talked to us about, and shared that that place, Matagalpa, is the ceremonial center of the continent, where Ecuador is a ceremon is the center of the earth, but the landmass of North and South America is different than the equator. So she said that there in Nicaragua is the center of the landmass of North, Central, and South America. And she also shared, and others shared with us that that place um, and Matagalpa, or near Matagalpa, Ometepe actually, was a place where the North and the South met. And Ometepe is another Nahuatl word which means two mountains. Ome, say Ome, Ome. And they shared with us of the significance of that place as well. And it's the second largest or the first largest freshwater lake in the world. It's the only place that has freshwater sharks, and it's under threat from I believe, a Chinese company that wants to create another canal there. But that place has a very significant um, sacred site. It's a very significant sacred site for many nations. Um, and one of the volcanoes or geysers shoots fire, and the other one shoots water, which is another representation of Atlachinoli, tying of the fire in the water. This is a representation or renaming of Anahuac as the north. Some people call it Turtle Island. Has many different names. Aslanahuac, Tahuantinsuyo, or Aviala for the whole north, central, and south. And Tahuantinsuyo means the land of the four quadrants. And this is just a way to rename the ancient territories. They're ancient, but they're not. It's renaming, it's sending out that vibration of the language, of the names and the meanings of these places again. And when we speak in these languages, it's a way to communicate with the natural world, because the natural world remembers these languages, because with indigenous cultures and traditions, everything has life. Mountains have life, the water has life, and we have a relationship with those things. And when the vibration with the vibrations from the tones of these ancient languages, or our languages, our indigenous languages, when we speak to them, there's a memory that's there of communication and relationship with those places. And so part of this work is reconnecting with those, and part of that's through ceremonial running. And with the staffs, there's a 10-year-old runner in 100 and some degrees in Sonora and with really bad humidity. These staffs also weave the communities together. They weave the fires, they weave the sacred sites. One of the things is there's been a fracturing of the communities. So this prayer run weaves the communities together. The staffs also do like a cleansing, a limpia of the land. So that's part of our work, is doing a cleansing of the land and amarando, tying the nations together. And we don't do it as runners, but these sacred instruments, the bastones, do that. This is a Tarumara runner. Is a brother. I can't remember her name. She ran with us too. But there's a documentary of a young Tarumara mujer runner, that she has been winning like the Boston Marathon, the New York Marathon, and but they don't. You don't hear often of the feats of the indigenous peoples from Mexico or further south. But there's a documentary that's out. Um, as I mentioned before, the communities. If it's not for the wasn't for the communities, the run wouldn't happen. They provide us with everything. Again, going tying the sacred places is that there's territories that nations live in, but there's traditional territories, and there's a distinction. Traditional territories are the territories that they had pre-Columbian or pre-European or pre-colonization. And just because they don't have or occupy that territory doesn't mean that there's memories, that there's ancestors, that there's energias, that there's relations and of that land. So when we go into each territory, we make an offering, but we request and to be brought into or able to cross into our territories, and that's just done as a protocol for ceremony and a protocol to respect traditional territories. These are runners from little youngsters from Rio Yaqui. Um, the Yaqui staff is the one that the young man is running, or young boy is running with in the front. And I love the slingshot. I did similar things when I was a little chavalito. Um, Families, and this is like the LA area. Um, so we do run in urban areas, and I was going to show a video of the run, and I'm contemplating it. Well, I'll just play it, and if you skip over it, well, you can skip over it. But this is the last thing I'll show. It's a video of Peace and Dignity Journeys from the Mexican organizers, and they created this video. It's Tiffany from. So that was the organizers from Mexico. The majority of those pictures were from a place called Washington, which is north of Tikal, where we had our closing ceremony for the year 2000. So with that, I just wanted to thank you for listening in. Hopefully I was able to touch on the Peace and Dignity journeys, the meaning of it, its history, the prophecy, the gathering of Quito, integrating the peoplehood model into some aspects of the work and its significance, and brought in a couple of or few examples and questions from the reading. So um, again, thank you very much, Tlaso Kamati, for listening to this presentation.